All right, we are going to segue now into a new section of Middle Eastern history, turning away from looking at just the Arab-Israeli conflict, or I guess the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and looking at the Middle East as a whole through these post-war years and into the 80s and even the 90s. Keep in mind that as across the world, independence movements are starting to flourish. It's going to happen in the Middle East as well. Middle East, many of the countries here will receive their independence after World War II, but because of the fact that the Middle East holds so much petroleum, superpowers, major superpowers, end up fighting in the area. Radical Islamist parties will end up gaining popularity in this region. They're militant. They reject the West, and they hold on to traditions. This is where we start to see the ideas of an Islamic state, or a holy war, a jihad against the West. And what develops is the Arab Cold War, which in the end is a fight between secular and religious forces. Many Arabs supported the Nazi regime during World War II, quoting the famous quip that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? So it wasn't that Arabs necessarily supported Nazi ideology. They were interested in getting the British out of the way. The British, of course, opposed Arab nationalism, had held a lot of the Middle East in a ruling mandate, especially as you now know in Palestine and in Iraq. And also they had for years been in control of Egypt, right, which only is now going to receive their independence. The British, sensing the fact that the Arab world is stacked against them a bit, sees a need to satisfy them and to keep up with their demands, to have a presence in the area and access to petroleum. What they do is create an organization known as the Arab League in 1945. It was supposed to basically create a pan-Arab cooperation, so that all the different Arabian areas could more or less work peaceably with each other in the Middle East. But what ends up happening is feuding, infighting between the two. And after World War II, the world will be split. I'm going to pull up Arab League real quick. The world is going to be split between conservative pro-monarchy forces. Those countries are Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Jordan. And then revolutionary forces, which is Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. And that division still exists more or less today. Here's the Arab League. Okay, so founded in March 22nd, 1945. There's the flag, and as you can see, the countries will include all of North Africa, as well as many in the Middle East. Okay. Anyway, they split from each other. There's not a ton of cooperation. We actually see this split with the Arab-Israeli war. And the pro-monarchy forces will generally ally with the West a little bit more, whereas the revolutionary will forge their own direction. Also in 1952, Gamal Abdel Nasser, which you've already talked about, overthrows King Farouk in Egypt. The king was particularly blamed for losing Palestinian territory during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, so he is deposed. Nasser, as we've already mentioned, is very convinced that a strong Egypt is essential for the balance of stability in the Middle East, and that means less Western development. He wants to build this dam, the Aswan High Dam, to increase irrigation for agricultural production inside of the desert. I've also mentioned the West supported the project, but Nasser moves to the Eastern Bloc, so Eastern Europe as well as the Soviet Union and China, in order to be more neutral and kind of take a third way of sorts, and he ends up losing the result of the West, and the Middle East will become another locale for Cold War tensions. Now, the Arab Cold War, all right, is going to be a little bit different than the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. After the 1956 Suez War, okay, and the Israeli basically ends up winning that war militarily, although diplomatically they don't get a peace settlement, and it's kind of a political fiasco. There was a wave of anti-Western and pro-Nasser sentiments in the Middle East. Okay, pro-Western conservative monarchies feel threatened by this new wave of nationalism, and what we end up getting is a setup in the Middle East where conservative regimes and revolutionary regimes battle each other for influence and control of the Middle East. And this is the Arab Cold War. This is the very definition of the Arab Cold War. Also in 1958, the Soviet Union will agree to finance the construction of the Aswan High Dam, which officially will lead to the withdrawal of Western support for Egypt. We also see in 1958 an overthrow of conservatives in Iraq by a new party known as the Ba'ath Party. All right, they have a faction also that's in Syria, and also King Hussein in Jordan only avoids overthrow that same year due to British military intervention. Okay, the Arab governments are doing some good things. They're improving standards of living. They're improving education for both boys and girls. Petroleum-rich areas, very rich areas, like Saudi Arabia and Libya, and the Persian Gulf kingdoms like Kuwait, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, build new hospitals, homes, schools, airports, roads, basically everything, including infrastructure. In Kuwait, citizens get free education, university education, free medical care, and low cost or free housing. Now, if that sounds like communism, it sort of is, right? Like we kind of balance we take all of the money generated by petroleum revenues and balance it equally between citizens, right? The reason why is these countries aren't very big and they have an enormous amount of money. Though what these states are rich, sparsely populated, population-dense areas are generally more socialist leaning. This, of course, is espoused by Egypt, the largest Arab population, and little to no petroleum at all. We've also mentioned before that the U.S. and USSR were directly and indirectly involved in disputes in the Middle East. The U.S. is involved in Turkey. Remember, we house missiles inside of Turkey that are pointed at the Soviet Union. Okay, this is the whole reason why the Cuban Missile Crisis exploded in the first place. We admit Turkey into NATO for housing our military bases. But Turkey, all right, and Greece are going to argue over a little island out in the Mediterranean, not little, I guess, actually decently sized, but an island in the Mediterranean known as Cyprus. Okay, here's Cyprus right here. Now, Greece and Turkey, all right, both laid claim to the area. Most people in Cyprus had Greek heritage, and the Turks composed a minority. Okay, what we're going to see here to balance this dispute is another partition, and you all know how partitions go. Okay. Not by 1974, the UN divided Cyprus in Greek and Turkish portions, separated by another green line. Remember the green line that ended the Arab-Israeli war, right? It's drawn around the West Bank. Bad idea, especially because the U.S. government, even though they're outspokenly favoring Turkish claims, most of the people in the United States are overwhelmingly pro-Greek, and that's not an accident because there are many Greek immigrants that have since made homes in the United States. Turkey, as a result of this public opinion backlash, will move away from the U.S. during this time period. Okay. In the 70s and 80s, U.S. will rely on our allies in the area, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, to counter Soviet expansion. But in late 1970s and 79, the Soviet Union will move into Afghanistan, literally deploy troops there, support a leader by the name of Babrak Karmal, and he will become the leader of Afghanistan. The 80,000 troops the Soviets sent in will be opposed by militant Muslims, by a group known as the Mujahideen. Okay, Mujahideen is linked with the United States. They receive military training and aid from the U.S. and allies. Okay, fighting will continue in Afghanistan in this more or less civil war, and 1 million refugees will end up going to Pakistan. Now, the Mujahideen as militant Muslims, okay, is kind of the modern precursor of radical Islamic groups in that area, right, in Afghanistan. So when you're wondering where did the Taliban come from, we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but they are descendants to the militant Mujahideen that turned against the United States. Most Arabs of the time period opposed the Soviet Union. They're backing Islamic radicals. Mujahideen, though it's a militant organization, is not radical at this time period. Okay, the Soviets will basically leave the area a decade later after they invade in 1988 and 89. There's a huge strain on the Soviet economy, and the war is one of the main factors of the Soviet Union collapse. It's kind of an embarrassment to them. kind of similar to our Vietnam. The United States will also establish permanent naval forces in the Indian Ocean to ensure access to the Persian Gulf. Next event we want to talk about is the Lebanese Civil War. We have to remember the 1982 war that was started more or less because Palestinians had launched border raids into Israel in the late 70s. Israelis will bomb villages, will kill many civilians, and it basically plunges Lebanon into a civil war in 75 for over 14 years. It's mostly a disagreement, a religious disagreement between Christians and Muslims. Lebanon is actually pretty religiously diverse, with about half Christians and half Muslims in general, which we might find surprising for a Middle Eastern country. And they basically end up fighting each other for years and years and years. Israel interferes, Syria interferes, the major Western country interferes, and that ends up prolonging the civil war. And because Syria occupies parts of Lebanon and UN troops end up stationed there, the beautiful capital of Lebanon, Beirut, here's a picture of a postcard from the 50s, ends up basically becoming a battleground. And we'll look more at that in class as well. Next major event we want to talk about is the Iranian Revolution. Okay, 1970s, Arabs are turning to militant Muslims more and more. We see that with Mujahideen to fix all the problems that are kind of appearing in new nationhood, economic, political, and social. Many think that Western-based models, the capitalist or communist models espoused by the U.S. and Soviet Union respectively, cannot be applied to the Middle East. They're seen as kind of, those are the structures that work in Europe and in the West, but they're not going to work in the Middle East, okay? And so what many Islamic countries advocate for is a return to Sharia law or Islamic law. Thus again, the Arab Cold War is defined as a battle between secular and religious forces. In Iran, the U.S. Had supported a modernizing leader by the name of Mohammad Reza Shah. He has a huge military complex, more or less paid for by U.S. aid and petroleum revenues. Implements an event known as the White Revolution to increase agricultural and industrial production. This would be akin to some of the 5-year plans we see in China or in the Soviet Union early on in their nationhood. But it's not super effective. We see inflation, decline in some agricultural sectors, and increased political suppression through their secret police, known as the Savak. Iranians from both sides of the political spectrum, left and right, will overthrow the Shah in 1979, the same year actually that the Soviet Union more or less invades Afghanistan. So a lot of tension here in the eastern parts, northeastern parts of the Middle East. And what we get is new leadership under the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. All right, there's his face right there in the picture, right? And this is Sharia law. This is Islamic law. This is an Islamic state, okay? And Iran will go from a U.S. ally in the region to a U.S. enemy. Iranian leaders denounce the U.S. as, quote, the great Satan, want the Shah to be returned and tried for his crimes. The U.S. doesn't do so. And so what we have is an event known as the Iranian hostage crisis, where Iranians seize the U.S. embassy, okay, for a year. The U.S. freezes the assets, and basically they try to go in there and break everyone out. It fails, but finally, after a year of negotiation, the hostages are released. If you ever want to see a movie about this, there's a great movie known as Argo. Okay. So, yeah, it tells the story of the rescue of 6 U.S. diplomats from Tehran, right? So that'd be good to see. I think it won Best Picture, actually. So anyway, worth your time watching if you want to see it. Anyway, with the political infighting, the religious right emerged victorious in Iran. The mullahs, another name for the clergy, become a dominant power. They push, of course, for strict traditional values, traditional dress with women and behavior codes, and try to export their movement to other Middle Eastern states, including Algeria, Sudan, Egypt, and Jordan. And the last thing we'll talk about today is the Iran-Iraq and Gulf Wars. Okay, As we mentioned, Iran wants to export the revolution abroad. They look to Iraq, but the Ba'athist government that's there, okay, led by Saddam Hussein, wants to make sure that Iran will not attack, okay, to make sure, or I guess not spread their influence in Iraq. In September 1980, Iraq will actually attack Iran, and there ends up becoming about about 1 million casualties by 1988. Both powers spent more than $450 billion on this fight, and actually, your textbook makes a great point that it's as much money as the U.S. spent in all of the Vietnam conflict, which is crazy. So enormous amount of money. Iraq will get weapons from the Soviet Union, the United States, and other Arab nations. And Iran will get support from North Korea, China, and Israel. Now, if that sounds weird, right, why are the United States and Soviet Union funding Iraq while Iran is funding, is getting funding from Israel, North Korea, right? Like that seems like a weird combination. But the truth is that there's kind of some back dealing going on here. The U.S. will support Iraq, of course, during the war, but they do keep negotiations open with Iran. And basically, the war between the two countries becomes a distractor from other Arab nations wanting to attack Israel, right? They had gone through 5 wars by 1982. So if both sides could more or less augment the fight inside of Iran and Iraq, then there'd be no, or I guess a lot less attention paid to Palestinian-Israeli affairs, right? So anyway, it's kind of a convoluted war. It's war for war's sake, really, in order to get peace, I guess, somewhere else. But by 1988, Iranians are negotiating with the UN, and we get an armistice. Iraq will emerge as the military power in the eastern part of the Middle East, but it has a very weak economy, having borrowed money from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, in order to finance the war, right? These oil-rich areas, and they begin to press. They want their loans back, but Saddam Hussein basically says that Iraqis have fought and died in the war to protect these Persian Gulf states, protect the export of radical ideology, and they shouldn't need to be paid back, right? Because basically Iraq spent the money for them, right? Iraq will also accuse Kuwait of slant drilling, or drilling at an angle into petroleum reserves in Iraq. And as a result, in 1990, August 1990, Iraq will invade Kuwait, okay? And this seems, and it is, overt aggression. The international community condemns it, and it calls for immediate withdrawal. They don't go away. The U.S., through Operation Desert Storm, will bomb the area in 1991. It's a very, very quick victory for the U.S., as you can imagine. And basically, the pro-Western monarchy in Kuwait is put back in place. Iraq will be beaten back. Iran will now become the major military power and the strongest influencer in this area of the Middle East. But Saddam Hussein will remain in power, which we'll see becomes a bit of larger of a problem as we get into the 90s and early 2000s. All right, that is it. Big story, a lot going on here. Good luck with your questions, and let me know if you need anything. Shoop.